I have never been very good at painting. I, unfortunately, was not the 17-year-old Twitter artist who is so talented it makes you want to drive off a bridge. If I couldn't hide behind a line art layer and make everything a cartoon, my artistic ability melted away like a digital artist seeing the sun for the first time. I've trudged through color and light studies, frantic four-value studies, and the impenetrable topic of edges, but I couldn't quite break through that barrier. Now, after a long time of debatably diligent practice, I've expanded beyond just making goofy little cartoons, but can also be relied upon to make goofy little paintings as well. This journey is encapsulated by this horrifically out-of-season painting of a vampire going to the beach. Today, I'll be walking through my process of creating this character and learning to overcome my painting woes. Given that creatures of the night have sort of become my comfort zone, I thought it would be a fun character design scenario to figure out how a vampire gets to the beach while the sun is blaring overhead. So I started doodling on my cave walls and created some initial thumbnail sketches to choose from, all playing around with how this vampire lass would keep the sun off her skin. Animated tree chair providing shade, palanquin held up by compelled labor, and giant sun hat all appealed to me. But the actual character and illustration part of this piece were really just a vehicle for the actual heart of the project, which was to create a capital P painting that I would be proud enough to place alongside the rest of my work, stuck to the family fridge that is my art station. You see, dear viewer, all the art that I'm proud of that I've made so far in my life has almost been exclusively in one certain style. This style has of course evolved as I've gotten better and more comfortable with fundamentals such as composition, anatomy, and perspective, but the common theme you may be seeing is that they're all bound together by a line art layer that sits on top of the piece while the color and rendering are contained below. This gives my art its distinct cartoony look, and I do feel it properly reflects the core of my eternal soul. The insecurity I've always had, however, is that the style is certainly not a choice, but more of an automatic output. I don't know how to actually paint, you know? Like, create a piece that's held together with lighting and shape and form, and not held together by an ink scaffolding. This is what I mean by painting, something created with shape and edges as opposed to lines. I don't know if that's an academic description or not, but it's what I'm going to use to make sense of the distinction. Obviously, one is not better than the other, and many artists stick to one style and hone it to a razor's edge. But for me, I would personally like to be able to grasp every part of the art fundamental period and not keep certain floors locked away and hope nobody asks to see them. Besides, most of the time that I see a really good artist that inspires me, they can usually do both, indicating there's certain base skills that need to be brought up in my case. Back to the thumbnails, I asked my Scottish friend which one he liked the best, and he chose number 8. I like this spur of the moment kind of deal where the character had slapped on some unrelated items that looked incongruent fashion-wise, but were functional to keep the sun off. I expanded on the clothing options, thinking I was going to go with this little number with a wetsuit/pant combo, because I thought I could do a cool thing where the baggy pants hang low and a little bit of the hip shows. I even got all the way to the sketching phase before it dawned on me that none of this was communicating a beach-like vibe. Like, you don't look at this character and think, that's a vampire going to the beach. It's more like a goth girl with baggy clothes on. And if I wanted to do a cool hip exposure, she would need more effective cover so her anterior superior iliac spine doesn't burn up in the sun. I scrapped this initial character and decided to continue with the runner-up of the thumbnails, the big sun hat. As with most artists who've spent their entire lives on a piece of plastic that connects to Clip Studio Paint, my digital painting journey began with consuming countless hours of how to render and best digital art workflow style tutorials over the course of my finite time on Earth. My preferred source for a long time was Dave Rapose's Patreon, which I've subscribed to for a number of years. I voraciously consumed every video he posted of a new refined workflow that allowed him to create incredibly intricate paintings of goblins, pigmen in astonishingly short amounts of time. Most of the tutorials that I consumed of this variety were not really what I needed to be studying. Reverend Rapose's overviews of his workflow are useful for someone who is already comfortable with the fundamentals of form, anatomy, etc. And brother, that was not me. As much as this sounds like your dad telling you to eat your vegetables, I didn't really see any significant progress until I reduced painting down to its fundamentals. I needed to understand how to break a painting down into simple shapes, how light works when it's cast onto a form, and if I was feeling really brave, I could delve into the impenetrable topic of edges, which are the transitions between the shapes. I really enjoyed the Artist Master Series Color and Light, which gives an almost scientific breakdown of how light behaves as it's cast on an object, and relating it to more traditional art concepts like value structure. This gave me a solid understanding of light that I could take with me when I started practicing. I also really liked Med's map on Proko.com, as that breaks down and demonstrates a lot of basic painting concepts that are hard to come by in a digital context. After deciding that the bucket hat version of the character wasn't going to work, I drew this thumbnail to further explore the large sun hat and beach skirt. I was pleased with the silhouette and thought this idea would better communicate that the character is prepared for the sun. I took that and returned to the drawing and restarted the character sketch. Her face I drew a few thumbnail ideas for and opted for the smaller, rounder facial shape. Then I did further exploration into the hair and sunglasses before landing on some shades that flared out like a bat wing. I enjoyed the sharp shape language the glasses made, so I replicated it with a bat pin on the hat, in the trim on her bathing suit, and on the bottom of her beach skirt. She is also in some platform slides because I saw something like that on Pinterest and thought, that'll work. Next, I set up some flat colors with a red-blue color scheme and a yellow accent. The flats will be the base that I paint on top of to bring this character to life. Despite finding a variety of helpful, studious resources to bolster my painting ability, I still felt lost in the woods in the lead up to this vampire project. I was desperately searching for that last piece of understanding that would make everything I learned so far finally fall into place. I understood the concepts better for sure. I had painted the form sphere. That was making sense to me. But I was still bewildered on how to take that and turn it into a real painting. In one of those bits of grand irony, the epiphany that I needed to have is that there was no epiphany. There's this Marco Bucci video from only 8 short years ago that demonstrates the importance of shapes. This tutorial was the skeleton key, for me at least, for understanding how to actually put all this knowledge together. It comes at the end of the video where Mr. Bucci places a John Singer Sargent portrait on the screen. He outlines every light and dark shape, places them to the side, and establishes that these are the collection of shapes that make the painting. He's just revealed the skeleton of the piece, the structure that lies beneath. To put it all back again, he places the shapes in the right order and starts using brushwork to soften the edges between the shapes. And before your eyes, an exact replica of the portrait arises. All painting is, and ever was, are shapes and edges. Shapes dictate the structure of the piece, and edges communicate the transition between those shapes. This reduction of the skill really acted as a lighthouse beacon guiding my sinking ship to shore. Everyone gets lost in the swamp of obsessing over other artists' workflows or habits or brushes or whatever, but having "it's just shapes and edges" repeating over and over in my mind freed me to just sit down and practice. No longer would I have to fixate on obtaining some piece of arcane knowledge that would open the floodgates to competency. Anytime I would get distracted and see a Dave Raposa painting and start feeling my life force drain away, I could refocus myself with "it's just shapes and edges." I was, for the first time, able to organically decide how I wanted to work instead of just neurotically copying all the artists that I like. As long as I could get the shapes in the right place, everything else would follow. I started doing a lot of simple grayscale studies of monster sculptures I found on Pinterest and screenshots of movies that I like. These types of photos tend to have good shadow and light areas to study from, and I could map these tones with hard edge shapes to practice what I had learned. Working with solid graphic shapes helped me push my understanding of light and form, as I had to be exact in the placement of each shape. After spending a while with this graphic style, I took it out for its first maiden voyage by completing this piece of an alien attacking some scientists. I actually did a video on this piece too, and I'd prefer not to reflect on the quality of it. I finally felt confident enough in my shape game to add a pinch of brushwork into the soup. In my spare time working on other stuff last year, I painted this piece of a nice purple lady sitting down. It isn't perfect, and it isn't really a completed piece either. It needs some reflected light. It's a very dark composition. But it holds a special place in my heart because it's the first thing I ever successfully painted that started as graphic shapes then had refined edges on top like in the Marco Bucci video. Improvements would need to be made, but I had my proof of concept. I did some other practice paintings through the course of 2025, mostly of vampires, and you can probably tell coming up with this project's theme didn't exactly strain my mind. But my comfort level with this painting style was finally high enough to start working on this beach-going vampire. So, after the flats, I laid down an initial shadow color and a darker shape to communicate ambient occlusion shadows. I have this bristly brush that I got from this Sergei Samarsky brush pack on ArtStation that I use to render edges. After the shapes are laid out, I took that bristle brush and softened the edges where the form turns, and added lighter and darker brushstrokes where needed to describe the secondary forms. I could go into how I made each individual form, but the mindset here is to make the shapes that communicate the form, then soften the transition between those shapes. I do the same thing for the bathing suit where I have this initial shadow and light shape that acts as a base. Then I add more light to the lights to build up the form of this reflective material and make the shadow even darker to create depth, while also adding reflected light coming up from the bottom. This approach of laying down a shape, softening the edge, and repeating continues to the beach skirt. While I do like the shape and the gesture of this initial try at the skirt, the harsh overlapping folds felt a little too severe, like she stole Batman's cape and put it around her waist. I repainted it with softer folds and added a little knot to better describe how it's staying tied. The character painting ends with these red bats scattered around the fabric, which are definitely not inspired by any fighting game character that I've drawn in my past. I did like the character, but at this stage, I did feel bad that I never came up with a real backstory for her. Nothing beyond it would be neat if a creature of the night went to the beach. Looking for inspiration, I spent some time perusing the rulebook for Vampire the Masquerade, a tabletop role-playing game where you play as vampires in a secret goth society, immersed in clandestine intrigue as the discordance between your unholy soul and your unappeasable bloodlust cleave the delicate threads of your humanity. And the eyes of the girl who asked me, "What book are you reading?" in the PAX West board game section start to dart towards the nearest exits. There's a sample backstory for the furry vampire clan of Veterinarian, which I thought could be a neat idea to play with. A person whose love of animals doesn't extend to man once they turn undead. They also have the power of animalism where they form a bond with an animal companion, so I thought I'd buck the trend of making all my characters cat people and give this gal a dog to go to the beach with, including a matching pair of swimming trunks and a bat collar. The character and her dog are now out of the oven, so I begin to figure out the composition of the illustration. I drew 4 ideas, each playing with how she's spending her day at the beach. One is her standing in the foreground with a drink as her dog and a few volleyball players stand in the background. Next was her lounging and throwing a frisbee to the dog. Third was her on a hammock with the dog in her lap. And finally, her sitting at an outdoor bar, much like I am wont to do myself. Of these selections, I went with number 1 because I like the depth that it has with the houses on the other end of the shoreline. I think it creates a better space for the character to inhabit. But I will have to figure out what the cooler over here looks like, as it's kind of a top 3 character in the composition. I painted a basic cooler stuffed with the Vampire Day Trip essentials of blood packs and raw organs. To drive home the animal lover theme, I created my own Live, Laugh, Love style stickers, but flavored for someone who squeals at every passing dog. Complete with catchphrases such as "got dog" and "gotta pet my pupper." I also wanted to place a drink in her hand, a summer cocktail that would seem innocuous at first, but be infused with some sort of blood imagery. I was looking at Ahem on the beach and thought it'd be very spooky if it was blood instead of cranberry juice. Here's the final painted mixed drink. I don't have footage of me drawing it, and that's definitely because I hit it out of the park on the first try, and not because I screwed up the glass rendering so many times I stopped hitting record on OBS. It has a syringe filling the drink, along with a suspiciously red fruit garnish and eyeballs more conspicuously floating in the drink. With the cooler and drink sorted out, I created a 3D model to base the lighting off of. I placed a human figure in the foreground and pulled up some geometry for mountains, then dotted palm trees and a beach volleyball net in the background. I placed some buildings to create a resort town in the far distance. The models of the buildings I made a year or two ago when I was doing a Mario Kart illustration and attempted to recreate Delfino Plaza. That illustration went nowhere, so I sent Mario, Luigi, and Rosalina to the Shadow Realm and exported the buildings for the background of this piece. This means this vampire character canonically exists in the Mario universe. I was going to create a little Dachshund sculpt for myself before I quickly realized I was out of my very shallow 3D depth. I googled 3D dog model and found this created by Canal 3D. I rigged up the little dog and placed them into the scene next to the cooler. All the volleyball players are placed around the net, along with this guy to be turned around staring at our main character. Speaking of which, I placed a giant round plane on the main character's head to act as a makeshift hat. My magic crystal ball tells me this was not the correct decision, as we end up changing it later. I added a giant sun to the scene to bring in some light, along with the ocean with a big blue plane. One press of render image later, and we have a 3D model to get us started for the actual painting, which we can finally begin. The 3D model render is placed in a new Photoshop document for me to begin sketching over. I lay in rough gestures for each of the main figures while leaving the far background pretty much alone, because that's not going to be detailed enough to warrant sketching at the moment. I have a general idea of where everything is, so I started making more detailed decisions with a refined sketch. I lay in some more specific details for the palm trees and volleyballers in the background, getting everybody into some kind of sports pose. The refined sketch allows me to start work on a color key. With an airbrush, I experimented with what colors and values I wanted to use in the piece. I know the sky is going to be this bright, saturated blue and the sand a warm yellow, so I place those in the scene as a base and make sure that whatever colors I use for the other elements in the piece are going to play nice with everything else in the scene. This is all in the hopes of not having to make significant color changes after 20 hours of rendering. I set up some flat shapes, referencing the color key I made on another layer. Then I created a main shadow shape with a purple tone and some blue ambient light coming from above the character. Using the same process as the character painting, I softened the edge to create the turning form. I placed every shape I needed to get going, then started blending away. I have heard the advice that you're supposed to work on a painting as a whole first before rendering any single part fully, but I have something to prove to myself, so I render out the whole character enough to satiate my fragile ego before moving on to the rest of the piece. There is a post a pro Tekken player, Joey Fury, made recently where he dissects the difference between knowing about a skill and the know-how to perform a skill. For example, most of us know how to walk, but if we were asked to describe the mechanics of how walking works, we would need to consult with an expert who has enough knowledge about walking to explain it correctly. One of my hangups as an artist is thinking that I need to know everything about a skill before I can get the know-how to perform the skill. After this whole learning process, for the first time it feels like my know-how has exceeded my knowledge about painting. I wrote 3 different paragraphs to explain how I painted the eyes on this character, and I couldn't really describe it any more than I just put the shapes in the right places, and I feel like that's a good position to be in for now. The features felt good enough to satiate my worried mind, so I bounced around the rest of the figure and added in all the warm bounce light that would be reflected off the sand and hit the bottom-facing planes of the figure. I don't know if bounce light would disintegrate a vampire, or if only the direct rays of the sun are deadly. If you want my headcanon, it isn't the UV rays themselves that cause a vampire to burn up, but the holy power of God contained within the sun's rays. And the holy power of God is not reflected by silicate particles. The blood on the beach makes an appearance, complete with the syringe and bloody orange. You would think having fancy Photoshop tools like the pen, symmetry, and distort tools would help me make the glass in fewer than 10 tries, but never underestimate my ability to have to do something over and over and over again. After that, I begin the first pass on the palm tree in the background with a kind of gnarly bark pattern that I do not like looking at. The cooler didn't give me too much trouble. After painting the main character, I finally believed in myself enough to paint a simple red cube. I apply a cool shadow shape with the same warm bounce light coming off the sand. Second pass on the palm tree with larger, wavier shapes that I immediately abandoned to begin the third pass on the palm tree, and the fourth pass on the palm tree. For now, the fourth pass is acceptable enough for me to start painting the dog. I carve out a silhouette for the dog and throw down a shadow shape around him and on the cooler. I had to mess around with the shadow color. There was some trouble figuring out how saturated to make the parts of him that received sunlight. I should have figured this out in the color key step, but things happen. A silhouette of a heart goes in his maw to be delivered to the cooler, and I begin to render all the doggy forms such as the legs, paws, and face. I also rendered the blood packs and iced organs in the cooler off screen, so you don't get to see it. Sorry about that. But I do throw in some highlights and blood trails here. Fifth pass on the palm tree, now trying to adhere more rigorously to the color key, but the desperation is welling up within me. The least planned out part of the painting gets reworked almost as much as the palm tree. The background began as these overlapping hills, and I placed some building silhouettes there as placeholders. I thought I could get away with some simple green swirling shapes for foliage, but as I haphazardly placed a drunken meandering dirt road down the hill, I knew more serious changes needed to be made. I took another look at my references and I realized there's more of a cliff face that rises out of the scenery in these photos and not a rolling grass hill. I got rid of the initial attempts and painted in some rock faces with sharper, more jagged shape language. Placed on top were green grassy areas that the buildings lay on top of to convey a town built on the cliff face. Then I dot the landscape with green swirls for vegetation, which I feel are more effective this time with all the other shapes there to support them. After the vegetation, I created simple two-tone buildings to bring the town to life. I just randomly chose warmer pastel colors. This mostly resolved my background issues, so I tried my hand at the palm trees again. The specimens further in the back went much smoother than the one closer to the foreground. Speaking of which, I started the 6th and 7th pass on that tree, which I believe is the final one. The final major element to be blocked in are the volleyballers. I painted orange swimsuit guy first as he's going to be looking at our main character. I painted his eyes normal size before realizing they can't really be seen at a distance. I repainted him with some saucer plates so the viewer can better experience his dumbfoundment at what is happening in the foreground. For the rest of the ballers, I lay in some simple musculature and vary the color of their swimwear. I filled out some remaining to-dos, rendered the blood orange finally, finished the buildings, and added some foreground shrubbery to occlude the main character a bit more. The biggest remaining task had to be the sunglasses that I've neglected this entire time. I render in her shades and all the necessary cast shadows to make it look like the glasses are actually sitting on her face. Then, I decorated the cooler with the epic pupper stickers that I made during the concept phase. I took the stickers and copy-pasted them onto the illustration, distressing the material and warping them so they look like they're stuck onto the cooler. That was the last element I placed before perhaps the most important phase of any project, community feedback and critique. I asked some of my artistically inclined friends if they would take a break from bonding with their families over the holiday season to give me feedback on my painting of a dog holding a heart in its mouth. I received many pieces of feedback. I knew this painting was going to be filled with more mistakes than usual because, once again, I've literally never done this before. The first change is remaking the sun hat. I very much over-relied on the Blender reference and didn't make a convincing hat for this character. As pointed out to me, the hat didn't read correctly. It seemed like there was just a giant floating disc on her head, because that's exactly what it was when I made the Blender model. I erased the hat and remade the silhouette to reflect the initial character design a little more, making the brim more of an interesting Pringle shape and showcasing the crown of the hat. The new hat allows me to add some fun blue ambient light and the cute bat emblem from earlier in the video. The hands have been kind of terrible this whole time, so I erased and repainted them. For one hand, I copied a study I completed as a warm-up one morning that I thought would work well in this illustration. For the other hand, I took a picture of myself holding a glass and copied that. I cleaned up all the placeholder decisions and ensured everything looked like it belonged. Stuff like more realistic shadows cast by the volleyballers, more distinct waves on the shoreline, and I repainted the blood trail left by the dog with more appealing splatter shapes. I ended the painting process with some color correction, atmospheric perspective, and, finally, the dog collar that I completely forgot to add until this point. With that final addition, and after much ado, this vampire lass and her dog are ready to be presented to the class. Not to claim this is like the best painting ever or anything, but more so than most of my projects, I'm very, very pleased with this result. Most pieces I make feel like they miss the mark somehow. The grand ideas I have in my head surrender to the compromises that have to be made in order to make a piece of art actually exist. But starting from zero has a way to make you appreciate any kind of significant progress. There's never an end to learning and improving, but I am happy to have brought my skill set this far with this fun painting of a cool gal and her pet. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.